Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou has been released to China after reaching a deferred prosecution agreement with the U.S. Department of Justice. It has sparked global attention. So what happened in the background of this sudden event? How will it impact China and the U.S. in the future? On September 17th, Canada's The Globe and Mail first revealed that the U.S. Department of Justice had resumed negotiations with Huawei and its lawyers over Meng's case, and that the negotiations involved a deferred prosecution agreement that would have allowed Meng to return to China if the deal had been reached. On the afternoon of September 24th, Meng appeared by video in federal court in Brooklyn, New York, and reached an agreement. Meng left for Vancouver right after and immediately took off on a chartered plane, arriving in China on the night of September 25th. The judicial hearing on Meng's extradition to the U.S. concluded in August 2021, and a ruling was scheduled for October 21, 2021. Meng's sudden release is a significant reversal of an event that occurred before the ruling date. Official Chinese media broadcasted the flight and airport pickup live, launching a patriotic propaganda campaign where Meng's return to China was portrayed as a national celebration. According to an online analysis by professionals in China, Meng's flight, chartered by the Chinese government, cost 6 million RMB or $930,000.
所以是美国想用这种方式来抗击咱们中国的崛起，是换一种方式而已。但是他们太小看中国人了，太小看咱中国的力量了，有14亿人支撑的，什么人干不灭他，是吧？中国人最牛逼的。
昨天因为我没有去到现场，我是在那个线上那一边在观看它整个的一个直播记录，然后我有在意到昨天的一个直播平台是有1亿人在线的，所以的话，也是能够感受到全国的同胞就是说，一样非常的期待他回来。
In 2018, after Canadian police arrested Meng at the Vancouver International Airport at the request of the U.S., the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, immediately arrested former Canadian diplomat Michael Kovrig and businessman Michael Spavor and charged them with espionage. Michael Spavor was sentenced to 11 years in prison by a Chinese court, and both have been held for 1,020 days. According to Kovrig's family, he had been held in solitary confinement and lacked communication with people. His prison cell was only 9 square meters. The lights were on all night, and he was even restricted from reading for a while. Meng hired a strong legal team right after her arrest. A week later, she was released on 10 million Canadian dollars bail and lived in a mansion she owned in Vancouver. Meng's husband and 2 children arrived in Vancouver in late 2020 to be reunited with her. On Christmas Day of 2020, Meng chartered a restaurant and invited 13 guests to her party. In an interview with the Voice of America, a Toronto-based international human rights lawyer said that, in contrast, it was clear that the Canadian legal system provided a more fair legal process for everyone who was charged. The 2 Michaels were hostages held by China, and they did not have the protection of the judicial process. Hours after Meng left Vancouver on a plane, the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, announced that 2 Canadians detained in China had also been released and were on their way back.
About 12 minutes ago, the aircraft carrying Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor left Chinese airspace and they're on their way home.
quick release of the two Michaels was equally surprising, as some analysts had previously speculated that the CCP would continue to hold them even after Meng's release. No one had expected Beijing to immediately release the Canadians, which is tantamount to an admission that it committed hostage-taking. Of course, Beijing will never admit it to the outside world. To the inside world and the Chinese people, Beijing can easily have the media collectively block the news.
孟晚舟事件同康明凯、迈克尔案件的性质完全是不一样的。那么很多的媒体，包括很多加拿大媒体都已经注意到，加方本来就不应该给美国干脏活，加方应该汲取教训。
On September 27th, White House spokeswoman Jen Psaki said that Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping spoke on September 9th. The case of Meng Wanzhou was mentioned, as was the case of the two Canadians.
He raised the two individuals, the two Michaels, who have been released. Very positive news. It should not come as a surprise that President Xi raised the Huawei official. But again, there was no negotiation on this call. These two leaders raised the cases of these individuals, but there was no negotiation about it. It was President Biden raising and pressing again for the release of these two Michaels, as is something that happens in every engagement we do with the Chinese, or had up to this point in time.
孟晚舟女士的平安回国是中国党和政府不懈努力的结果，是全国人民鼎力支持的结果。
Another blocked issue in the Chinese media concerns the agreement Meng signed with the U.S. in exchange for being allowed to return to China. U.S. prosecutors previously charged Meng with conspiracy to commit bank fraud and wire fraud, among other charges. On September 24th, the U.S. Department of Justice issued the following statement. Acting U.S. Attorney Nicole Bookman for the Eastern District of New York said, in entering into the deferred prosecution agreement, Meng has taken responsibility for her principal role in perpetrating a scheme to defraud a global financial institution. Her admissions in the statement of facts confirm that while acting as the chief financial officer for Huawei, Meng made multiple material misrepresentations to a senior executive of a financial institution regarding Huawei's business operations in Iran in an effort to preserve Huawei's banking relationship with the financial institution. The truth about Huawei's business in Iran, which Meng concealed, would have been important to the financial institution's decision to continue its banking relationship with Huawei. Meng's admissions confirm the crux of the government's allegations in the prosecution of this financial fraud, that Meng and her fellow Huawei employees engaged in a concerted effort to deceive global financial institutions, the U.S. government, and the public about Huawei's activities in Iran. Meng's admissions are evidence of a consistent pattern of deception to violate U.S. law. Judging from this statement, the agreement signed by Meng is a good docket and testimony to the fact that Huawei, a CCP company, has been expanding and committing crimes overseas. Meng may have returned to China, but it does not save Huawei from its predicament of being shut out on the international stage. In order to ensure the public's right to know, courtroom artists have sketched a representative scene of the trial for the media to use. In the courtroom image released on routers, Meng is seen crying, which contrasts dramatically to the image of her arriving in China. Of course, Meng's crying image won't be seen in China, as it would bring shame to the motherland, according to the CCP. In addition, there was another interesting detail dug out by overseas Chinese. It's discovered that Meng's flight to China did not follow the usual route, i.e., flying over the North Pacific or through Alaska. Instead, it flew to the North Pole, avoiding the U.S. airspace across the Arctic Ocean, through Russia and Mongolia, and arrived in Shenzhen, China. This has led people to speculate whether the CCP was extremely nervous, anticipating the possibility that the U.S. would suddenly backtrack and hijack the plane midway. Meng gave a speech at the airport upon landing, where she first thanked President Xi and declared that her faith was Chinese red.
习主席关心我们每一位中国公民的安危，同样也把我的事情挂在心上，让我深受感动。祖国是我们最坚强的后盾，只有祖国的繁荣昌盛，企业才能稳健发展，人民才能幸福安康。 我想说，有五星红旗的地方，就有信念的灯塔。如果信念有颜色，那一定是中国红。
It's interesting to note that the red dress Meng was wearing when giving her speech is by an American designer from New York. It's a genuine American red, which should offer ordinary Chinese people something to think about. In Meng's case, the Department of Justice has left a vague statement about whether she pleaded guilty. It can be interpreted as a guilty plea under one condition or as no plea under another. Such ambiguity is beneficial to the CCP. Media in China has thus made a big deal out of her not guilty plea, shaping her as a national hero. Why then did the US suddenly release Meng to China in this manner? Well, there might be some relation if one connects the dots between the major events of the recent past. On September 15th, the US, UK, and Australia suddenly announced a new security alliance, AUKUS. It's the equivalent of the Three Eyes taking precedence, with Canada and New Zealand being relegated to the second tier of the Five Eyes alliance. The impact of Meng's case on Canadian politics is far more significant than in the US. The Canadian federal election took place on September 20th. When it was over, the US immediately agreed to release Meng, possibly because the Biden administration tried to make up for Canada, its political ally, to a certain extent. One of the most talked about aspects of the AUKUS partnership is that the UK and US will help Australia build at least 8 nuclear-powered submarines. It means a complete upgrade of the previous Indo-Pacific strategy. If Australia has nuclear-powered submarines, its routine cruises will be able to cross the South China Sea, which Beijing claims to have sovereignty over, and reach as far north as Taiwan. Beijing was so outraged by this move that the Global Times, an official media outlet of the CCP, has criticized Australia as a lapdog of the US. The three countries have been secretly negotiating for 6 months, during which time China and the US have also repeatedly discussed Meng's case. These discussions have overlapped on the timeline. As mentioned in previous episodes, the US, UK, and Australia alliance could spur Beijing to launch an early war against Taiwan. For the current US administration, it's clear from the public statements of the President and the Secretary of State that the last thing they want is a sudden outbreak of war in the Taiwan Strait. Is it possible then, during the negotiation of AUKUS, Washington had already considered how to appease an outraged Beijing? For the CCP, the new US administration has given it some hope. Beijing is eager to see the relationship between the two countries return to the Obama era. According to the China News Service, when the US and Chinese foreign ministers met in Tianjin in June 2021, the CCP handed the US 2 lists, a list of wrongs to be corrected and a list of priority cases. The list of corrections included the unconditional lifting of visa restrictions on CCP members and their families, a lifting of sanctions on CCP leaders, lifting of visa restrictions on Chinese students, a lifting of registration of Chinese media as foreign agents, etc., and finally, the withdrawal of Meng's extradition. Meng is the eldest daughter of Huawei boss Ren Zhengfei and his essential assistant. Huawei is widely believed to have a CCP military background. Therefore, the Chinese military would not wish to see Meng's extradition to the US, as she might be forced to reveal CCP secrets, including the use of Huawei equipment to spy on the West, details about China's transactions with Iran, and other hidden secrets that the public was not aware of. This is said to be the most crucial reason for the CCP to do whatever it takes to get Meng back. So, what is Beijing willing to do to rebuild the US-China relationship? Recently, there has been widespread power shortages in China, with many areas blacked out. Some local governments have announced that periodic power outages will continue until around March 2022. Power shortages in China have been analyzed in the September 24th episode. One of the main factors for electricity shortage in China is the price hike of coal. With the official pricing of electricity fixed, the more electricity a thermal power plant generates, the bigger the loss. As a result, power plants in China have reduced their generation capacity. Among the reasons for the coal price hike is the unusual shortage of coal. This, in turn, is related to the Communist Party's campaign to reduce carbon emissions. Xi Jinping even stated at the UN General Assembly on September 21st that he would not build coal-fired power plants abroad.
中国将大力支持发展中国家能源绿色、低碳发展，不再新建境外煤电项目，加快落实联合国2030年可持续发展议程，构建全球发展命运共同体。
For decades before, Beijing, claiming to be a developing country, has never taken the so-called environmental issues seriously. Why does Beijing now take them so seriously? The carbon reduction campaign has exacerbated China's power shortages, making the coming winter even colder. Yet, despite the great cost, the CCP's top echelon is still pushing forward the agenda. The current U.S. president and the party it represents have been holding up the flag of climate change and calling for a Green New Deal. When lining the two together, it becomes easy to tell why Chinese chairman Xi Jinping has chosen to go along with the environmental issues in a high-profile manner.
But we're not seeking, say it again, we are not seeking a new Cold War or a world divided into rigid blocks. The United States is ready to work with any nation that steps up and pursues peaceful resolution to shared challenges, even if we have intense disagreements in other areas, because we'll all suffer the consequences of our failure if we do not come together to address the urgent threats like COVID-19 and climate change, or enduring threats like nuclear proliferation.
Despite their intent, both Biden and Xi know that history has turned the page. The honeymoon between the US and China is now over. The two systems will never go back to the way they used to be, between the US and China, or, for that matter, between the two systems on a global scale.
美方应该认真的对标、对表，对自己呢有个正确客观的评价，不要动辄以民主代言人自居，不要在民主问题上搞双重标准，甚至多重标准，更不要试图把民主问题工具化。
There has been some assessment that this means a change in our China policy. That is absolutely not the case. This was a legal decision. Our policy and our approach to policy, our intention to hold China to account for its unfair economic practices, its coercive actions around the world, hold it to account on human rights abuses has not changed. Okay, go ahead.
So, is Meng herself the biggest winner in this case? Not necessarily. Given her unique experience, Meng is likely to be under even greater scrutiny in China than in Canada. As the political turmoil in China intensifies and relations between China and the US change, how her fate will turn out is hard to predict.